Hi friends, welcome to Comics Odyssey again. Thank you for joining me for week 2 of Understanding Comics, the Invisible Art. This is a chapter by chapter exploration of this arguably the most important work of comics, about comics. Week 1 will be linked below, and as you go check that out, I also request that you subscribe so you don't miss any of the subsequent weeks. Should be 9 weeks. Chapter 2 is called The Vocabulary of Comics, and it's a very dense chapter, so we'll do our best to condense it so that the video is not too long, but get comfortable. Let's dive in. It opens with Scott McCloud in his cartoon form discussing a painting by René Magritte, a French painter. This is a famous painting. If you haven't seen it yet, you can look it up. If you look up René Magritte, it'll be one of the top hits. So it's a painting of a pipe that says, in French, "This is not a pipe." And Scott McCloud explains that it's true. It is not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. But then he pauses and says, well, no, it's actually not a painting of a pipe. It's a drawing of a painting of a pipe. But hold on, it's actually not a drawing. It's a printed copy of a drawing of a painting of a pipe. But actually 10 copies. 6 and 4, right? So this whole thought exercise is to once again separate the medium from what the medium contains, the content from the container. And the idea is to look at things as they really are, but I think there's a problem with that, and we'll get to that soon. Then he says, do you hear what I'm saying? And while reading this, you actually do not hear anything, even though the word balloons create the illusion as if you are hearing someone speak, right? So he's pointing to the strangeness of media, and especially the comics medium. And then he gives a bunch of examples of images that represent other things that aren't that thing. Again, there's a problem with this line of thinking, and we'll look at that soon. So he says, this is the strange and wonderful world of the icon. So this is not a man, this is not a country, this is not a cow, this is not a planet, this is not law, and so on and so forth, right? There's a little joke here. Sync Press says this is not a company. And in interviews, I've heard Scott McCloud discuss how he regrets having put that there because after the publication of this book, Kitchen Sink Press actually folded as a company. So it literally is not a company. So hopefully that's not an accidental superpower. Here says this is paper, this is ink on paper. So he's trying to reduce things to their most component parts, which you could call that reductionism, right? And then he starts to discuss the different categorizations of icons, which I recommend getting the book to read about, to kind of read these specific types of categories of icons. Now, it's kind of not fair to discuss icons without discussing the masters of icons. And I got a book here that I'm pulling out for you. It's a book called Techniques of Icon and Wall Painting. Wall painting is not like painting your living room. It's like painting like fresco, murals, right? Wall painting. And here we're going to look at, you see, I had a good example here. Hang on, we're getting there. Are we? Are we getting there? Yeah, here. So we have the icon of a martyr, Elizabeth, martyred in 1918. And here's demonstrating how the icon is meant to have a likeness to the actual person, but to not be naturalistic, right? So you're supposed to be able to know by way of a sort of simplification of a cartooning sort of technique that this painting represents this person, but it is not a like photorealistic. It's not meant to, so it still obeys the principles of icon art, right? A lot of the reason for certain types of decisions and rules that icon art making follows is that it points to a spiritual reality, and so it doesn't focus exclusively on the material, the physical aspects of what it depicts. A very interesting book. It talks about the various compositions of icons and the movements in them. Now, this is the Byzantine era, and if we look to how it developed, a few hundred years later, we have Albrecht Dürer, who concerns himself with much of the same compositional principles. We got like the cross composition, diagonals, movement is important, framing of the characters, but it concerns itself a lot more with the physical, like the texture, the shape of the figures, depicting all the muscles. You know, there's more anatomical detail added, so it becomes less iconic, right? So we'll come back to those principles as we explore this book here. He's talking about how iconicity is achieved through reductionism. So here we have like a photo, an actual photo or a reproduction of a photo of a man. Here we have a kind of more realistic, naturalistic drawing of the man, but then we kind of arrive into what we've come accustomed to in comic art, a more simplified, cartooned version of the same man, which still reads as the same man, but is more iconicized. And he says when you push the simplification further, you get even more cartoony until finally you strip it down to this most fundamental vocabulary of comics, which represents a face. So here we have this could represent, well, he actually goes through it here. This is a specific guy, and as you simplify, the drawing could represent more and more types of people, right? To when you have the ultimate reduction of to its most iconic form, it begins to represent a universal face. So this could be anyone's face. And his theory is that the reason that cartoons make such deep impact on the cultural consciousness, on pop culture, is because of this universal identification principle, right? And he's talking about cartooning is not just for visual stuff. For instance, you can cartoonify characters until they become archetypes of themselves, such as in The Wizard of Oz. Each of the characters is kind of reduced to, like a minimalist type of character. The lion's cowardly, the scarecrow's the lion lacks courage, the scarecrow is cowardly, and so on and so forth. So, or is that how it is? No, Scarecrow doesn't have a brain. I haven't watched that movie in a long time. And he's talking about this principle of pareidolia, where you see patterns where you wouldn't expect to see them. So this plug looks like a face, right? Page 32, there's an experiment that you can make, drawing just random shapes and adding just a single element to them makes each of the shapes look like a face. You can add that element almost anywhere within the shape, and it still makes the shape look like a face. But this circle and a dot, most people wouldn't mistake it for an eye, right? So there's something about the way our mind interacts with medium, wherein we participate in making the medium, making the image, making the story what it is. There's a distinction between different kinds of mediums, but comics is kind of unique in that it requires a significant amount of user participation, right? His thesis is that the reason why we're so drawn to this sort of thing is because we identify ourselves with it. And he's got this theory that when we are conversing with people, or like we're interacting with people, we see their face in detail, but our own face, we don't see it. We're not looking at a mirror, we're looking at someone else. So we have a cartooned version of what we look like, right? So when we see a cartoon, this resonates with this mind image we have of ourselves. I think that he's onto something, but I would frame it a different way. Just like the icon artist we saw earlier, that there was a reason why they didn't push the image to its most naturalistic depiction of the subject. It's because they were pointing to a spiritual reality, right? So you don't want to mistake the physical for the spiritual. So he words it as the realm of the senses and the realm of ideas. I would maybe overly on top of that the realm of the physical and the realm of the spiritual, so that when you depict a face in this way, you're not depicting a physical face, you're depicting the spirit of a face, or for you Jungians out there, the archetype of a face, which is kind of a transcendental reality that overlays over top the physical reality. That's how I think about it. Of course, when you're making comics, it's not really necessary to be holding that in your mind, you'll intuitively kind of learn from the works of great comics masters. But here he suggests how comics blends both approaches, the realm of the senses, realm of ideas, outward identification, self-identification, or as I would put it, physical and spiritual. Tintin here, Tintin character, everything is quite detailed, background, clothing, and all that. But Tintin's face is very cartooned. There's very few details to identify Tintin as Tintin other than the shape of his face and his haircut, right? And then he discusses how in Japan, this concept, which he calls masking, the blending of iconic cartooned characters versus detailed backgrounds, that detailed naturalistic backgrounds. He discusses how that became heavily used in the Japanese comics realm, and they even would flip back and forth, turning the dials on each of these approaches depending on what the story called for. For instance, the hero characters were cartooned, the villain characters were depicted more naturalistic, so that you identify with the hero and objectify the villain, right? Or, for instance, the sword is drawn in a very iconic way, but then when the story calls for drawing attention to something specific about the sword, it gets drawn in a very naturalistic way. Now he suggests there's different ways of measuring this scale. So he's like he goes from complex to simple, realistic to iconic, objective to subjective, specific to universal, and I would say physical to spiritual. Now he's like, is there a way to abstract and simplify this even more? He says yes. So in order to find out the answer, and we'll actually do the exercise here, he said draw a straight line from each of the dots to this height for the answer. So we'll do that. Let's take a look. Straight line. You should be able to see what he's pointing out here, right? Face. So this is the most reduced pictorial version of a face, but then you abstract it even further into letters, and it becomes a face that has zero resemblance to a face whatsoever, right? So he's talking about how words are the ultimate abstraction, iconic abstraction, or ultimate visual simplification of a face. And comics use words, so it's worth thinking about how words factor in to the visual thing, to the whole comics thing. Here, there's a whole kind of sidestep between how writers and artists are working in different directions, because the artists study the visual, the writers study the conceptual. I'm going to skip that part. It's just 2 pages, and it's kind of a tangent, so you can go ahead and read that in your copy of the book, pages 48 and 49. Now he's talking about how iconic abstraction is not the only form of abstraction. There is such a thing as non-iconic abstraction. So this triangle here comes to describe basically all the vocabulary of any art form whatsoever. So here we see him, the character, he's a cartoon form, going up this edge of the triangle, And as he goes up, he's more and more abstracted to the point where he claims to be just ink on paper, right? The picture plane. Now, the problem with reductionism is that this isn't ink on paper from a reductionist perspective, is it? Right? We can push our reductionist line of reasoning even further, is that this isn't ink on paper, it's molecules. These are molecules. And the molecules aren't molecules, they are atoms. And the atoms aren't atoms, they're protons and neutrons, and so on and so forth. To the point where describing anything in a reductionist perspective becomes incoherent. You can't really describe anything. So he is kind of pushing the idea that the reductionist line of reasoning tells you what a thing actually is. But I think it's the opposite. The iconicity and the depiction is actually what it really is, right? I can't say I can't communicate to you, here, take this collection of molecules, atoms, protons, and neutrons. I have to say, here, take this pencil. So the actual aggregation of the actual interpretation of the thing is the thing, right? So in the same way that the icon artists from the Byzantine era were reducing their images to their component parts, they weren't pushing it to the point of doing something like Picasso or those contemporary artists. They were balancing the physical and spiritual, the complex and simple, and the specific and universal according to this scale, right? A little bit difficult to discuss this topic without reading, but hopefully I'm not losing anybody here. I don't think I am. So he places various works of comics within this triangle, which is a graph that describes all different possible types of art. So we have the representational edge, which goes from reality to meaning, right? So we have a photorealistic image, and then reductionistic iconification, all the way to, we saw the face here, all the way to word. And further here, you could say face, you could say, as he says here, 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth. And then Shakespeare, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now. So it becomes more towards the meaning side of things rather than like the direct, blunt description of things. So we have like how we represent reality is represented directly, and more adding meaning until we enter to the realm of the written word. So we're kind of entering another medium in a way on this end. So he's got this slice. But then you can abstract towards the picture plane, towards the no meaning, no depiction of reality. And so, for instance, we have just shapes there that aren't representative of anything. Here on the side of language, you can make the words, you can abstract them until finally they lose the meaning of the words. They're more abstracted images. So like comics, sound effects are kind of along that edge. Conceptual edge, he calls it. The language border. and the retinal edge. So this is like specifically information that we process that through the visual, through the our ability to process images, whereas here it's more in the conceptual. So you can look at face, but you need some specialized understanding of what the letters represent in order to be able to read a face into it. Whereas here, you can look at a face and you just know it's a face because you've seen faces. You don't need any specialized skill in order to read images, right? This is why perhaps comics appeals to children who are, not literate or less literate than adults. Though I would argue that comics aren't, as we saw, separating the content from the container. Comics aren't inherently for children, just that they are perhaps especially well suited to appeal to children. And he's got the list of all of everything that's listed, everything's numbered, and you can check out the number and see what the artist is. So these are reproductions. So if we look at this one, 96, you look at 96, sells Hergé's Tintin, right? Betty and Veronica. Most of the well-known works of comic art are along the bottom edge here. They are representational in some way, right? Bone, Mickey Mouse, Tintin, Betty and Veronica, Superman, Plastic Man, Vision. As you move up, not exclusively, but you're kind of entering more in the underground. But we have Batman here from The Dark Knight Returns, Sergio Aragonés. I forget the character's name. Dick Tracy. There's still definitely a lot of there's a lot of this part here that's connecting with audiences, but a lot of it's along this line here. And so he's discussing the different comics artists, the different realms of comics, where within the graph that they kind of live. So Jack Kirby and Stan Lee staked out a middle ground of iconic forms with a sense of the real about them, bolstered by a powerful design sense, right, which would place them here. Tintin kind of uses pretty much the entire bottom line. Many American mainstream comics still follow Kirby's lead for storytelling, but the desire for more realistic art and more elaborate scripts has pushed art and story further apart in many cases. I disagree with his claim that the stories are pushed apart. To me, I think they're harmonious, definitely harmonious enough. So once again, he's pointing towards a world of possibilities. He doesn't want to restrict things with his graph. He's just trying to point out, what's out there, so that comics artists can make use of the full gamut of what's there. So, so that's chapter 2 of Understanding Comics, Vocabulary of Comics. This is a very dense chapter, and we went over it quite quickly. I highly recommend you read this chapter. I've read it several times now and find it quite useful. And I really remember being absorbed in this graph for days. So I was quite blown away by the concept. And it's so simple. It's so simple of an explanation of the realm of art. Really interesting way of a really good lens for learning about comics art. Next time we're going to talk about Blood in the Gutter, which is a little bit more comics art specific, how panel to panel transitions work, and how our mind processes these transitions. So I urge you to subscribe so you don't miss this next installment, and I think that's it. Best of luck to everyone. I hope you have a great week. I'll see you next time. God bless. Bye.